Did you know that there's a color our eyes can see that doesn't technically exist? It's called Stygian blue, and it's what's known as a chimerical color. These are colors that can only be seen when you stare at a saturated field of color. To see Stygian blue, you have to stare at a field of bright yellow for a good long time, and then immediately look at another field of black. It's a complicated process to explain why this happens, and we don't even really understand why it does. We don't really understand a lot of things. I bring this up because it's important to understand that there are things that we can see that don't technically exist. Sort of like how our brains compensate by movement by delaying the image we see by just a fraction of a second. I'd never really thought about this because it doesn't really matter. It's interesting, but it's not really important to everyday life, especially not in my job. I can't really talk about what I do. It's not classified or anything, but it's definitely a specialized field, and the last thing I need is for someone I know to read this and report it to my bosses, which they almost certainly would do. What we do, we have to be really mentally on our game, because if we're not, a lot of things can go wrong really quickly, and a lot of money can be lost. A lot of your money, frankly, since taxes are going towards funding things I need to do my job. What I can tell you is that what I do involves me being out in the open ocean for long periods of time, in a very small submersible that is capable of going down a very, very long way. It sounds a lot more exciting than it is, I can promise you that. But it's an interesting job, to say the least. Although a lot more cramped in there than you'd ever believe, this is not a job for the claustrophobic. It's also not a job for the people that are easily scared or prone to any kind of panic. I'm a level-headed guy. I don't scare that easily. I'm pretty small, so I was sort of uniquely suited to this work. I actually really enjoy it. The only thing I don't like is what I want to talk to you guys about, or I guess just give you a heads up about. We started noticing them about a year ago when I was doing some research at a pretty shallow depth, all things considered. At first we thought it was just some kind of weird camera anomaly, because the pressure really messes with things down here. We have a camera mounted on the little arm that extends from the sub. There's a few more arms that do different things, but one with the camera is important because that's how we can record things like silver lakes near volcanoes, which is something we didn't know existed until recently. But, as I mentioned, the pressure can really take a toll on the equipment, and glitches are nothing too abnormal. But this particular problem, we were noticing it happened with a good amount of frequency, and was almost always when we got below a very specific depth. It would start out small, and it was pretty easy to write off or work around it, but eventually it would grow and make shapes, really interesting shapes, ones that would make it difficult to pinpoint, and it was something physical happening. I'm not really sure there are words for the shapes we'd see, because offhand, I don't even know if there are any. Irregular polygons is the closest we came, always with straight sides and right angles, which again made it hard to determine that it was a real event. The first time it popped up, I was taking water samples near a hydrothermal vent because we wanted to know what kind of minerals were popping out of it. I noticed that there was a dark spot on the right side of the camera's view, so I adjusted the lens, and it went away for a little while, but it came back eventually, bigger, and I asked the surface if they were seeing it, which they were. It floated around, not coming too close to the arm of the sub, or the vent, but it stayed in the general vicinity. I was down there for a while, and it stuck with me the whole time. When I went back up, we messed around with the camera and tightened up some more things to see if that would fix the problem, but it didn't. These things kept popping up more and more. We never saw more than one at a time, but just about every dive we went on, we were seeing them. Irregular polygons, with this color that took me months to find a name for. Stygian blue, that impossibly dark color that's somehow even darker than black. When we figured out that they were really there, which took us quite a bit of time, the only thing we could figure was that it was some kind of weird sea life we hadn't seen before. Well, of course we were reporting this stuff, and we were able to prove that they were physically there by moving the arms of the sub in front of them. We ended up getting a grant to study them a bit more, and that's when we started to see what they could really do. Now at this point, when we got the grant, we'd never actually been able to go near one, because when we tried, they move away. Again, it was one of the things that helped us figure out that they were aware. This didn't necessarily mean they were intelligent, but at least somewhat aware of their surroundings. But because we couldn't get near them, we couldn't tell how big they were, or what they were made of, or why they were so impossibly dark. That was something that really perplexed us. What were these things made of that was so impossibly dark? We started doing night dives to see if maybe they were bioluminescent. They weren't, but somehow we could still see them. They were so dark that they stood out from the background. If you've learned anything about the ocean, you know that there's a point where absolutely no light can penetrate it. We went down that far, turned off all our running lights, and we could still see them. We had no idea what they were reflecting, if anything, but we could see them, always one at a time, and always a different shape. They were always completely alone. That was something one of the guys on the surface pointed out. We never saw any other life go anywhere near these things. Before we started doing night dives, we'd stick to the shallow areas, and we'd see a lot of life near the vents. But whenever these things came around, anything else in the general area would just clear out. It seemed that these things were predators, because the prey fish and other small creatures got the hell out of there fast. But for the longest time, we never saw them eat. It took us a while, but eventually we figured out how to get near them. The trick we found was to kill the running lights and let the sub basically go dead in the water. Once we did that, they'd come closer. The first one that did it was a fascinating shape, like a square with triangles cut out of it in arbitrary places. All the right angles, with no other form. It came up to the sub and circled a few times, and we agreed that it was checking us out. It paused in front of the camera at one point, and we got some amazing shots of it. At that distance we could see whatever it was. It had almost no density. It never turned its back on us, because positioning the cutouts didn't change. No matter what angle we viewed it at, it always looked the same. When we attempted to touch it with one of the arms, it took off. Not terribly fast, but at a good enough clip that we realized it had some kind of propulsion. What that was, we still don't know. They're sensitive to electricity, I think, but they got bolder the more and more we were down there with them. Eventually, they started to follow us as they realized we weren't a threat. We started referring to them as polys, because we didn't know what else to call them. We started playing little games with them. For instance, we'd have them follow us to the surface, where we'd move the sub around and have them chase us. We got really fond of them. Even though we didn't know what they were, we didn't have a clue. But they didn't seem to pose any threat to us. They were almost cute. During a mid-afternoon dive, a school of baitfish came through the area while we were interacting with one of the polys. The school went around us, but a few fish got separated and passed right by us. As we watched, one of the fish broke off from the rest and swam very calmly right up to the poly. It almost seemed like it was lured in by something, and the second it hit the surface of the poly, something happened. The poly gained density. That's the only way I can describe it. The fish fell into the poly, and in a fraction of a second, it was crushed by some unbelievably great force. The only thing I've ever seen like it is like the footage of the crab being sucked into a millimeter wide crack of a pipe. 1 second the fish was there, the next it was compressed and gone. Needless to say, we were both intrigued and alarmed looking back on it. I'm sure this was a deliberate way of what the poly was capable of doing. Things began to go downhill from there. Several physicists were called in to help us because we all agreed that whatever had taken place was way beyond anything we had ever seen. No one could explain the footage we'd shot. There was a lot of talk of some kind of weapon, that it was something man-made. I'm not sure if we failed to notice it before, or if we were allowed to see it, but the polys started popping up everywhere, much more frequently. When we dove to the sea floor, we'd find them laying on the sand, capturing and crushing whatever got near them. They'd float by us in the water, never coming close but always staying within sight range. And that's when they began to get bigger. Soon, we were seeing polys bigger than the sub, bigger than seals, and bigger than some species of whales. The variety and sizes were endless, never the same. People on the project started to get scared. The polys never attacked us, but we were beginning to get a sense that we were being surrounded. There were so many. We were losing count of how many we were seeing. They were devouring the bait we'd bring down, opening themselves up, crushing things inside them in fractions of a second. We started bringing rocks coated with a frozen layer of chum to see what would happen. The polys crushed them with no problem. We tried the same experiment with steel, concrete, and a very small piece of industrial-grade diamond. They crushed every single thing we threw at them. The last night of the project, there was an accident. As the sub was lowered into the water, a member of the crew got too close to one of the lines and they got snagged. We watched him hit the water. Another crew member threw a life ring down, and I moved the sub as quickly as I could. As I did this, the camera arm moved, and the screen was filled with that color. That impossible Stygian blue. The poly, which was twice the size of the sub, rushed up from below me and headed straight for the crew member. He didn't even see it coming. I radioed the surface to get him up, to get him out of the water, but in the fraction of the second it took to do that, the poly touched him. I watched his leg fall into the poly, where it swung as if suspended in the air. In a fraction of a second, it was gone. The stump of his leg was wrinkled, like at the end of a sausage. I don't even know that he had time to feel it before the poly took him up to the chest. It crushed him, and from the surface I could hear people screaming. I didn't see his face, but from what I could gather, the force was so great that the instant the poly crushed him, what remained of his lungs was forced up out of his mouth. The pressure must have been so immense that all of his remaining blood and tissue rocketed up out of his throat, blasting out of the sinus cavities and into the brain. I have to believe that he was killed instantly. The rest of him collapsed down onto the poly, and in a split second I saw his head. I saw the scalp was split open at the top, and then he was gone. The poly sank back down until I couldn't see it anymore. We haven't been allowed to dive anymore since then. We're heading back to the mainland, where we'll probably be debriefed. I can't imagine they'll let us keep our footage, and I guarantee we'll all be required to keep tight-lipped about what happened until we know exactly what these things are. At night, when I go out on deck and look out, I can see them following us just below the surface. It's amazing how clearly they stand out from the water, and I would have never known that there could have been anything darker than the ocean at night until we know what they are. Until we can figure out how to keep them away, and we can confirm that they don't exist anywhere else, I don't know that I'll feel safe. Because from what I can tell, they don't even need water to survive. From what any of us can tell, the only reason they're in the water is because that's what covers most of our planet. I really, really hope we're wrong. But for now, all I can do is warn everybody and advise that whatever you do, you avoid open water. Please, please.